If God of War 2018 could be described by some as a perfect video game, well then Ragnarok is what I would describe as a worthy sequel. But God of War Ragnarok is unfortunately not perfect. Despite what you may have been told, this game does have some serious flaws. It's simultaneously one of the most well-designed, beautiful and gripping games you will ever play, whilst also having some of the worst story pacing, UI design, and unnecessarily overcomplicated gameplay changes to things like shields when compared to the simplicity of the first game. Now, 2 years later and with a PC release just around the corner, I think it's a great time to look at the highs of Ragnarok, the lows of Ragnarok, what's been added in the last 2 years like the free Valhalla expansion, and whether or not God of War Ragnarok actually lived up to the hype. This is God of War Ragnarok 2 years later. The hype for the release of this game back in 2022 was unreal. When we got the first story and gameplay reveal trailer back in 2021 at the PlayStation Showcase, people absolutely lost their minds with questions and speculations. Would you get to fight Thor? Would you get to wield his hammer? How will Kratos and Atreus survive their doomed prophecy? With the first trailer we also got introduced to the tone, the various locations we would be visiting, and the clear enhancements that were made to a few critiques of the first game, namely in enemy variety. God of War 2018 was what some would call a close to perfect video game. The story was perfectly told with pacing that rivaled some of the very best films out there. But one critique that always got brought up was the fact that the enemy variety was lackluster. So clearly, Studio Santa Monica took that feedback to heart and with the first trailer showed us a multitude of different enemies and playstyles. The sequel to 2018's Game of the Year was looking promising, but there was some skepticism as well. How do you follow up one of the greatest games of the PS4 generation? Cory Barlog, the creative director of the first game, was not directing at this time, instead handing over to Eric Williams to handle the conclusion to this epic saga. Most people wanted this game to be a PS5 exclusive, but then it got revealed that it would in fact also be releasing on the PS4, and I'll be the first to admit that this news did rub me the wrong way, because I was one of those people that rather stupidly believed that releasing the game on older hardware would mean they would limit the game somehow. The last thing we wanted was a sequel to one of the best games ever made held back in scope and scale because they wanted that PlayStation 4 money. Other rumors started circulating, like the fact that the latest God of War story was always intended to be 3 games instead of 2. But Cory Barlog and Eric Williams collectively decided to do part 2 and 3 in one game, God of War Ragnarok. The reason? Well, because development on one game takes a minimum of 4 to 5 years. And they just didn't want players to wait a sum total of 15 years to finish one story. Totally fair reasoning in my opinion, as long as the game didn't end up feeling rushed. Fast forward to November 9th, 2022 and the wait was finally over. When Ragnarok released, it was met with nearly unanimous praise from critics and fans alike. For me personally, it was the best game I played back in 2022, just slightly edging behind the magnum opus that was Elden Ring. But despite God of War being one of my favorite games of that year, I did have many issues with it. But before we get to that, let's talk about the things I really liked. And I'll also keep story spoilers to a minimum in case you just haven't played it yet. The visuals. So the rumor that releasing the game on PlayStation 4 would somehow hold back the PS5 version was clearly unfounded, because this game is absolutely stunning. I can't speak for how it runs and looks on the PlayStation 4, but on the PlayStation 5, well, it's still up there with some of the best video game graphics and art design I've ever seen in a video game. The different realms all have such a distinct feel to them. When I move through these spaces, it still wows me every time I boot the game up again. Arriving at Svartalheim for the first time, and I don't know if I just butchered that pronunciation, but regardless, you realize just how big of a leap in terms of design they really took. The draw distances, the way the light interacts with the scenery. Going from a snowy winter wonderland to this bright and sunny location makes you so excited to experience all the other realms you never got to visit in God of War 2018. And yes, they are all this beautiful and all this varied in terms of design and scope. There's a literal optional realm in this game that you don't even need to complete for the main story progression, but it's simply there to make the world feel even larger, and it's filled with awesome side quests that you're gonna want to complete. God of War Ragnarok really nails the idea of its grand scope with its design choices. It's this larger-than-life story about the end of all the realms, and you really feel that scope traveling to all these different locations. A personal standout for me was traveling to Asgard for the first time and seeing the Bifrost in the distance. I was absolutely blown away that I was getting to experience this in my home, on my couch, on my PlayStation. And in terms of the design language, they are obviously going for realistic fantasy. Although I personally wouldn't have minded them leaning into making the characters like Thor, Heimdall or Odin look a little bit more fantastical. The design language does work well here, and it doesn't ever take me out of the story. One thing that also blew me away was how good the cutscenes looked and flowed. Clearly still going for that one-shot idea from the first game, it wasn't as apparently mind-blowing the second time around, but the detail and the emotion that these scenes have just showcase the brilliant direction and acting on display here. And when you catch yourself realizing, wait a minute, the camera hasn't cut once, that's when you realize the talent that these developers and artists really have. And when I get to my own personal critiques with this game, don't think it discredits the insane job Eric Williams and the rest of the development team accomplished here, because it's absolutely astounding work. The gameplay. As I previously mentioned, God of War 2018 felt good to play, but it got repetitive after the 100th fight with the same enemy type. God of War Ragnarok takes enemy variety to a whole other level. I'm not over-exaggerating when I say that some of these boss encounters gave me literal goosebumps. But before I get ahead of myself, let's talk about the basic enemies first. The basic enemies you fight all range from super easy to slightly challenging in great numbers, and the variety of these enemies are great. One moment you're fighting a standard raider, and the next a huntress that's half woman, half horse, firing arrows at you from her bow. And then the boss fights, from massive dragon fights with fire raining down from the heavens to a personal favorite of mine called Nidhogg. Again, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a dragon that protects the roots of the Yggdrasil tree from a curse you are trying to lift. I won't say anything more, but it's a truly mind-blowing boss fight. The gameplay is largely identical to the first game, with a few new special moves and finishes available for your Leviathan, Axe and Blades of Chaos. These weapons feel as satisfying as ever in combat, and the addition of a few new special moves go a long way in terms of actually making the combat feel fresh. Luckily for us, they also introduce one new weapon type, the spear, which functions exactly how you would think a magic spear would. The spear multiplies itself, meaning you can impale enemies with a number of reappearing spears and then use triangle on your controller to detonate those impaled spears. I won't give too much away, but the spear is super satisfying to use, and the special moves you unlock throughout your journey are truly epic. In combat, you are balancing using your axe and your blades and then your spear, constantly switching back and forth when overwhelmed by enemies or trying to defeat those bosses, some of which are truly overwhelming and challenging. It's not a reinvention of the 2018 combat system, but a refinement, and it never felt better. I absolutely love the combat in this game. And for me, there is a definite improvement going from God of War 2018 to the combat system in God of War Ragnarok. The characters. Man, God of War Ragnarok has some amazing characters, some of the best written characters I've seen in a game. From Heimdall, a proper jackass with the gift of foresight, or a literal magic squirrel with split personalities. They are all written with so much care, with moments that genuinely made me laugh out loud, shed a tear, and even get angry. All because the quality of the directing, the writing, and the acting of these characters are second to none. When it comes to the main cast, both Kratos and Atreus are expertly portrayed with the father and boy moments that tug at the heartstrings. The dynamic they have in Ragnarok is clearly an evolution of the rocky relationship they had at the start of 2018's God of War. Atreus speaks his mind a little more, he takes a lot more risks, and Kratos on the other hand is more reserved in his anger. He is, as the trailer implied, thinking more like a father instead of a general. The game also nails these minor stories that get told as you are just simply walking or traveling on the boat. Characters just chat in moments of silence as you would in a normal scenario. It's also, in my opinion, not obnoxious, because I really appreciate these added moments where the characters are just simply talking and existing in the places you're currently in. The characters will walk and talk and comment on things that add to the world building or perhaps even to the character building, all just further enhancing your relationship with them. And some of these moments are just hilarious.
Father, think I'll ever have a beard like yours?
No.
And that brings me unfortunately to the lows of Ragnarok, of which the story is a major one. Although I love the characters and I seriously love some of the big emotional moments that this game does really pull off, I can't help but feel that the story is a little too bloated. It's simultaneously a story that feels rushed and a story that feels like it's dragging. It's such a weird conundrum, but it's very apparent that the story was always meant to be 3 games rather than just the 2, because Ragnarok's pacing is all over the place. One moment the story feels like it's going at breakneck speed and important character beats are just happening one after the other, and then the next the game comes to a screeching halt for no other reason than the writers perhaps realizing they should slow things down, otherwise players might feel they are reaching character and story resolutions far too quickly. Inadvertently though, them compensating for this breakneck pace by adding these sections where nothing really happens without adding much in terms of additional story makes the pacing feel really uneven for no good reason. Without getting into too many story spoilers, the biggest problem Ragnarok has is with its 2 main protagonists. And unfortunately, I feel the character that gets the shortest end of the stick is Kratos, in favor of developing Atreus, because Atreus needs the time to develop into the character he needs to be by the end of the narrative, and we don't have a whole nother game to do that, so we have to develop him now, in this game. What that means is that large portions of the game you are actually playing as Atreus and not as Kratos. Now the concept of that might sound really cool, and when it happens the first time I promise you it is quite cool, but I'm sorry to say, but by the 5th time I switched over to Atreus, I got really irritated, and here's why. Going from Kratos with his large arsenal of weapons and moves to Atreus with just his bow feels like a massive step down in terms of the gameplay. So then the story needs to heavily compensate for the lack of interesting gameplay, but unfortunately it just doesn't, so then you're stuck with a game that isn't as fun nor as gripping as it was when you were with Kratos. Now, I might be in the minority on this, as I haven't seen a lot of people complain about the Atreus sections of the game, but for me it's where the game takes the hardest hit in terms of pacing. All I ever wanted to do when I was playing as Atreus was get back to playing as Kratos. I just think how it was implemented was really bad. Think of it in this way, if instead of giving me control over this inexperienced Atreus with a limited arsenal, we had a whole other game after this one, so that in this game, Atreus just develops as a character on his own, and perhaps develops his moves and gets even more weapons. When we are finally handed control over him for the first time in a 3rd game perhaps, we have control over an Atreus that has the level of skill that is more similar to Kratos, and then the gameplay could have felt more engaging and the story progression more seamless. Where unfortunately now it just feels like we're going backwards in terms of gameplay, and then the story inadvertently feels rushed. I am all for surprising and subverting expectations, but don't give me a worse character to play just because you're rushing to get through the story. And these sections aren't short by any means, some of which can take up to 40+ minutes to complete, and by the end, you've played almost 10 hours of this game as Atreus. If it happened maybe once, I wouldn't be bringing it up, but unfortunately it happens enough times that it eventually lowered the overall fun I was having with this game. Maybe let me know down in the comments if you felt the same way or if I'm perhaps overreacting. Now besides these pacing problems, the story in general is still satisfying. The emotional moments still do hit, albeit at the cost of some very drawn out sequences. There are plot twists that genuinely surprised me, and I can still walk away from this game knowing that the conclusion to the story is still largely successful, which in and of itself is a massive feat, and hats off to the development team because that is an amazing accomplishment. The UI and the shield. Am I the only one that feels the UI in this game is absolutely terrible and overcomplicated? This is not an RPG. Why are there so many numbers, stats, text, and tabs? I just don't get it, especially coming from the first game where the UI was so clean and minimal in its design. Going directly from 2018 to Ragnarok feels like a massive step down in the UI design. I'm not against adding damage numbers and stats, but seriously, you're telling me this UI was the best you could come up with? It's a sensory overload, and even after completing the game, if you were to ask me now for advice on where to find something in the UI, I literally couldn't help you. It's that bad. And of course that is a personal gripe, as is the next thing that I'm bringing up. The shield? Oh man, this really bugs me. I really loved the shield in the first game, and till this day it remains one of the best parts of the combat in 2018. The parry felt so satisfying and crunchy, and the moves you unlock with that shield were really cool. Now in Ragnarok, shields are an additional weapon type that you find. Your original shield actually gets taken away from you, only for you to have to experiment with all these lesser shield types that are simply put, just worse. I just don't really like them, and when I got my original shield back, I just stuck with that again, cause in my personal opinion, the original was the best. And I think that summarizes my biggest gripes with Ragnarok, and with sequels in general. Changing things for the sake of changing them, not necessarily making them any better. We get a longer story, but it feels more bloated and simultaneously rushed. We get another character to play, but he is not as fun as Kratos. We get a different UI, but it's obviously worse. We get gameplay changes to things like the shield that are completely unnecessary. We have a game that is not as good as the first, but it probably never could be. The first game was the special combination of a raw vision and simplicity, and sequels almost always get stuck trying to one-up the other, and very seldomly actually accomplish that. I understand why this happens. Give people a game with minimal changes to the UI and people immediately think the development was cheap. Make no changes to the gameplay and people wonder why this game wasn't just DLC. It's the sequel conundrum, you have to change and upgrade things. That is why even now looking back 2 years later, I can truly say I love and simultaneously hate some of the things in Ragnarok. Moments of its greatness are sometimes overshadowed by moments of its overcomplication. It's a great game, but not a masterpiece. It's a game that concludes the saga admirably, but can't help but struggle getting to the conclusion seamlessly. The Valhalla DLC. I kinda wish the DLC released with the game back in 2022, because now, 2 years later, PC players get to experience a game that I feel is way more balanced. The DLC, whilst being immensely fun, also adds so much depth and character to Kratos that I felt lacked in the main campaign. He has actual purpose here, unlike in the main campaign where he is just kind of following Atreus around the whole time and doing what he's saying. I don't want to elaborate on this DLC too much, but just trust me, it's truly fantastic and worth experiencing after you've completed the main game. That's all I want to say. And there you have it, a comprehensive look at God of War Ragnarok 2 years later, after its release and right before its debut on PC. While the game is undeniably a visual masterpiece with compelling characters and engrossing gameplay, for me it struggled with pacing issues and overcomplicated design choices that left me longing for the simplicity and balance of its 2018 predecessor. Yet, despite its flaws, Ragnarok succeeds in delivering an epic conclusion to Kratos and Atreus' saga, full of emotional highs and daring narrative twists, and I can't help but wait with bated breath for what Studio Santa Monica will do next. If you enjoyed this 2 years later retrospective, please do go check out my Starfield 1 year later, which I think you'll also like.